The photo showed her daughter, smiling on a playground, and the message beneath it froze her blood. Delia Marsh had uncovered proof that her employer ignored deadly electrical failures and tried to frame her for exposing them. Then an unknown enemy sent her the exact time her 5-year-old daughter left school. Delia had rejected the Mafia boss, money and protection only 1 day earlier. Now with her child being watched, she picked up his blank white card and called the most dangerous man in the city. The tires screamed against the wet asphalt, with a sound like tearing metal that ripped through the heavy noon air. It was a Tuesday, just an ordinary, suffocatingly hot Tuesday. Delia Marsh had exactly 10 minutes left on her lunch break. She was sitting on a cracked plastic crate. She was eating a cold, stale cheese sandwich. She was thinking about the red Final Notice electric bills stacked on her cheap kitchen table. Then the sky fell. A massive black limousine tore through the heavy steel guardrail of the overpass directly above her. It did not just crash, it flew. It plummeted down like a broken bird. It smashed into the concrete right in front of the construction zone. Glass exploded outward like a grenade. Shards rained down on the street. But the crash was not the worst part. The violent impact snapped a high-voltage municipal power line. The thick black cable whipped down across the pavement. It trapped the crushed vehicle in a deadly, sparking cage of raw blue electricity. The air instantly smelled like acidic ozone and burning rubber. The crowd on the street screamed. A massive bodyguard kicked his way out of the front seat of the wrecked car. Blood poured down his face. He yelled at everyone to get back. People ran. They panicked. They pulled out their cell phones. They recorded the horror. They just watched, but Delia did not run. She did not pull out a phone. Through the shattered, spider-webbed rear window, she saw a frail hand, an old woman, trapped inside, fading into the smoke. The heavy car was groaning. The metal was shifting. It was teetering right on the edge of a deep concrete ravine. Most people would wait for the fire department. Most people would freeze in terror. But Delia was a municipal line worker. She knew electricity. She knew death. And she knew exactly what happened when people just stood by and watched tragedy unfold. She dropped her sandwich. She grabbed her heavy, rubber-insulated cutters from her leather tool belt. She did not think about the lethal danger. She did not think about her empty bank account. She thought about a human life. She sprinted straight into the spitting, sparking death trap. The bodyguard screamed at her to stop. She ignored him completely. She timed the violent arcs of the blue electricity. The flashes blinded her eyes. She swung the heavy steel cutters. She put all her weight into the rubber handles. Snap, the live wire went dead. The terrifying hum stopped. The sparks vanished. She did not pause to catch her breath. She grabbed a heavy steel wrench. She smashed the jam door window. The jagged metal sliced her arms. Blood dripped down her fingers. She did not care. She reached inside the luxurious interior. She grabbed the old woman by the shoulders. She pulled hard. She hauled her out onto the wet street. They hit the pavement together. 2 seconds later, the car's weight shifted. The metal groaned one last time. The limousine slid off the concrete lip. It plummeted into the dark ravine below, with a deafening crash. Silence fell over the horrified crowd. Delia sat on the ground. She was panting. She was bleeding. She was holding a stranger who was barely breathing. She had just saved a life. She should have been treated like a hero. But she was just a working-class widow with empty pockets. And she did not know it yet. She did not know that the swing of her wrench had just grabbed the throat of the Holloway City underworld. She had just saved the grandmother of the most feared Mafia boss in the entire city. And she had just walked straight into the middle of a brutal war. 2 hours later, with her hands wrapped in cheap gauze, Delia was standing in a freezing corporate office. The air conditioning bit into her skin. Her work boots left dirt on the pristine white carpet. Gerald Ashworth sat behind a massive mahogany desk. He was the chief operating officer of Brightline Power. He wore a suit that cost more than her yearly rent. He did not ask if she was okay. He looked at her with pure corporate ice in his eyes. He turned a laptop around. He played a security video, but it was wrong. It was cut, spliced. It showed Delia smashing the car window with her heavy wrench. It did not show the live wire. It did not show the sparks. It did not show the rescue. It just looked like a crazy worker destroying expensive private property. Ashworth's voice was like dry sandpaper. He accused her of abandoning her post. He accused her of reckless endangerment. He accused her of exposing the company to millions in liability lawsuits. He suspended her on the spot. No pay, pending termination. Delia stood there, stunned. Then it all clicked into place. The substation near that overpass had been failing for 6 months. The cables were rotten. The workers had complained. Ashworth had ignored every single report to save money, to pad his own quarterly bonuses. If the truth came out, if the investigators knew a live bright line cable had nearly killed someone, Ashworth would go to federal prison, so he needed a scapegoat. He needed to fire the crazy electrician before she could talk. Dalia felt the blood drain from her face. It was not out of fear, it was out of a deep, familiar rage. She walked out of that glass building. She rode the city bus to the edge of town. She unlocked the thin, wooden door of her tiny apartment. Posey, her 5-year-old daughter, ran into her legs. She had a gap-toothed smile. Pure innocence, Dalia knelt down. She hugged her daughter tight. She smelled the cheap strawberry baby shampoo. She looked up at the wobbly shelf, a picture of Caleb, her husband, smiling in his bright yellow hard hat. Caleb had died 2 years ago, not in an unavoidable accident, in a tragedy born of corporate greed. The scaffolding collapsed because his company bought cheap, rusted bolts. They traded his human life for a few extra dollars on a spreadsheet. Dalia knew that pain. The system had crushed her once. It had left her to raise a child entirely alone. She wiped a single tear from her eye. She looked at her bandaged hands. No, not this time. She would not be crushed again. Meanwhile, across the city in the VIP wing of Holloway General Hospital, the air was freezing for a completely different reason. Roderick Vance stood by the glass window. He did not speak, he did not move. He did not have to. The entire hospital corridor was locked down by men in sharp black suits. Roderick was the Shadow King of Holloway, a man built of violent strategy and absolute silence. But looking at the fragile old woman in the hospital bed, his grandmother Margaret, his chest tightened. She was the only person who had ever truly loved him. When his parents were murdered, she took him in. The lead trauma surgeon walked out of the room. His hands were trembling. He handed Roderick's lieutenant a small plastic evidence bag. Inside was a piece of the limousine's brake line. It was not worn down, it was not frayed. It was sliced cleanly, with a laser cutter. The crash was not an accident. It was a professional hit. Roderick did not scream. He did not break the glass. His rage was a quiet, suffocating thing. It was the calm before a tsunami. He walked out of the hospital and gave one single order. Find the shooter. Find the leak in his organization. And find the brave woman who saved Margaret's life. The very next afternoon, a sleek black town car rolled to a silent stop beside the curb. Dalia was walking home from the unemployment office. She was clutching a stack of useless forms. The street was strangely empty. The air felt heavy. A tall man stepped out of the shadows. He wore a dark, tailored suit. His posture was perfectly straight. His eyes held a quiet, terrifying weight. He did not need to introduce himself. Everyone knew the face of Roderick Vance, the man who owned the shipping docks, the man who owned the silence in this city. He looked at her, he spoke in a low, even voice. He said he was there to pay a massive debt. He reached into his coat. He offered to wipe away every single one of her bills, to secure her daughter's future, to give her a life where she would never have to worry about a price tag again. It was a golden ticket, a way out of the grind. Most people would have fallen to their knees in gratitude. They would have taken the money and ran. But Dalia tightened her grip on her papers. She looked him right in his cold eyes. She saw the dark shadows clinging to his expensive coat. She knew a gift from a man like this was a chain. She shook her head. She kept her chin high. She said her life was not for sale. She said she did what any decent human being should do. She did not want his dirty money. She did not want his dangerous protection. Because once you owe the devil, you are never truly free again. Roderick did not flinch, but deep in his eyes, something shifted. It was respect. It had been years since anyone had looked at him without trembling. He nodded slowly. He did not push her. But before he left, he handed her a plain white business card. It just had a phone number on it. Nothing else, he told her. She was standing in the middle of a war zone she could not see. He told her to call that number when she realized she could not fight the monsters alone. Dalia took the card. She walked home. She knew she could not rely on an underworld king to save her job. She had to fight her own corporate battle. She needed the absolute truth. She needed the unedited video, the real footage from the bridge. She waited until midnight. She put on a dark hoodie. She drove her beat-up car to the Bright Line maintenance depot. She sneaked past the sleepy security guards. She walked into the server room, the blinking green lights, the hum of the massive machines. She had friends in IT, working-class kids who hated Ashworth. Her hands flew across the keyboard. She bypassed the low-level corporate security. She dug deep into the deleted files server, and there it was, the raw camera feed, the massive sparks, the rotting electrical cables, the absolute, undeniable proof that Gerald Ashworth's negligence had created a death trap. She downloaded it. The progress bar crawled. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She slipped the silver flash drive into her pocket, a small piece of plastic holding the heavy weight of justice. While she was pulling data from the light, Roderick was pulling secrets from the dark. At a cold, abandoned warehouse by the freezing water, the truth was bleeding out. Roderick stood over a trembling man, a trusted lieutenant in his own crime family, a man named Elias. Elias had sold Margaret's private travel schedule to Silas Crow. Crow was the rival Mafia boss, a ruthless snake trying to swallow the entire city. Roderick did not yell, he did not raise a hand. He just placed the offshore bank statements on the wooden table. The bribes, the dirty money. Elias begged, he cried, he blamed the pressure. Roderick looked at him with absolute, terrifying emptiness. He stripped the man of his name, his protection, his life in the city. Roderick walked out into the cold night air. The traitor in his house was dealt with, but the snake, Silas Crow, was still out there, and Crow now knew his perfect assassination plan had failed. He knew a random electrician had ruined his murder. Two completely separate paths, a mother fighting corporate greed, a mob boss hunting a killer, and they were about to violently, inevitably collide. The text message arrived at exactly 4 p.m. Delia was sitting at her tiny kitchen table. She was organizing her defense notes. The screen of her phone lit up. Just one photo, no words at first. It was a picture of a playground, a bright yellow slide, and a little girl with curly hair laughing. It was Posey. It was her daughter's kindergarten. Then a second message popped up. The exact time the school bell rings. And a simple, chilling sentence beneath it. Some secrets should stay buried. If you want her afternoons to stay peaceful. The phone slipped from Delia's sweating hand. It clattered against the hardwood floor. Her lungs forgot how to pull in air. The world spun. This was not a threat to her job. This was not a warning about a corporate lawsuit. This was pure evil, unfiltered terror. They were watching her baby. Silas Crow's men were hiding in the shadows, aiming at the only thing that mattered in her entire life. The primal fear of a mother tore through her chest like a knife. She ran to the window. She locked the front door. She felt completely, utterly powerless. She knew the police could not stop a shadow. The legal system would not protect a poor worker's child from an invisible mobster. She was suffocating in her own living room. Then, her panicked eyes fell on the kitchen counter. The plain white card, the string of black numbers. She had sworn she would never get involved with a man like him. But her pride meant absolutely nothing now. Her principles meant nothing now. Her daughter's life was on the line. Her hands shook violently as she dialed the phone. 1 ring, 2 rings the deep. Calm voice answered. She did not say hello. She just stammered, the school, the photo, the terror crushing her windpipe. Roderick did not interrupt her. He listened to her raw panic. Then he spoke exactly 2 sentences. Your daughter is safe. I give you my word. That was it. But the absolute, chilling certainty in his tone was like a heavy steel wall dropping around her house. 10 minutes later, she cautiously looked out the window. A heavy, armored black SUV was parked across the street. 2 massive men in dark suits were standing near the corner. Silent, watchful, the shield was up. Her breathing finally slowed down. The paralyzing fear vanished. It was instantly replaced by a cold, searing rage. She was ready. The next morning was the formal disciplinary hearing. Delia walked into the Brightline Power boardroom. Her back was straight. Her uniform was perfectly clean. The USB drive felt heavy in her pocket. Gerald Ashworth sat at the head of the long, polished table. He was smiling, a greasy, arrogant smile. He played his fake, edited video. He talked loudly about her reckless behavior. He demanded she be fired immediately and sued for property damages. The wealthy board members nodded in agreement. The trap was springing perfectly. But Delia stood up. She did not tremble. She did not cry. She walked straight to the projector console. She plugged in her drive. You want to talk about corporate safety, Mr. Ashworth, she said, her voice ringing clear and incredibly loud. Let us talk about the truth. The massive screen flashed. The real, raw video played. The sparks, the exposed, rotting cables. The terrified crowd in danger. The board members visibly gasped. Delia used every ounce of her technical knowledge. She explained the lethal voltage, the failed maintenance, the deliberately ignored safety reports. She cornered Ashworth with undeniable facts. He started sweating. He started stammering. He tried to shout her down. He ordered the security guards to remove her from the room. The boardroom was descending into total chaos. And then the heavy oak doors swung open. The room went dead silent. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop. Roderick Vance walked in. He did not ask for permission. He walked right to the center of the room. He dropped a massive leather folder directly on the table. He looked at the shocked board members. He looked at Ashworth. He spoke quietly, but the words cut like broken glass. He said he was there representing the victim of the crash, and he brought gifts. He opened the folder. The offshore bank accounts, The massive cash bribes Ashworth took from Silas Crowe to ignore the accident scene cameras, the systematic negligence, the fake reports. Roderick laid it all bare. Ashworth's face turned the color of wet ash. His jaw trembled. He tried to speak, but his voice was completely gone. Roderick leaned in close. He told Ashworth the hard evidence was already at the police station. The empire of lies was over. Security did not take Delia away. They grabbed Ashworth. The smug executive was reduced to a shuffling, broken shell. Corporate justice was cold. It was swift, and it was absolute. Delia watched him fall. She had won her war in the light, but the real violence was just waiting for the sun to go down. Silas Crowe knew he was losing his grip on the city. His spy was gone, his corporate pawn. Ashworth was arrested. The walls were rapidly closing in, so he rolled the dice one last, desperate time. He targeted the woman who broke his perfect plan. That evening, Delia was driving home from her late shift. The narrow road near the abandoned industrial docks was pitch black. Suddenly, bright headlights blinded her rearview mirror. A heavy truck slammed into her rear bumper. Her old car spun out of control. It skidded violently into the gravel yard of the empty warehouses. The engine died. 4 men jumped out of the truck. Crowe's enforcers. They carried heavy iron pipes and suppressed weapons. They moved in fast, but Crowe made a fatal miscalculation. He did not know Roderick's shield was already shadowing her. Before the thugs could touch her car door, the night exploded with roaring engines. 3 armored black SUVs tore into the dusty yard. Gravel flew everywhere. Roderick Vance stepped out of the lead car. The air turned to ice. His men flooded the yard. It was a brutal, incredibly fast collision. Fists and heavy steel. The sickening sounds of breaking bone and heavy thuds. But Delia was not a helpless damsel in distress. She was not going to just sit in the car and scream. She kicked her jammed door open. She dropped to the dirty gravel. She crawled past the chaotic fighting. She saw the heavy electrical main distribution box on the rusted warehouse wall. She knew the city grid. She knew how the power lines worked. She ripped the metal panel open. She grabbed the massive main breaker switch. She yanked it down hard. Boom. The sparse streetlights died instantly. The entire yard plunged into absolute, pitch-black darkness. The sudden blindness threw Crowe's men into total panic. They stumbled. They cursed. But Roderick's men were ready. They wore night vision gear. They swept the yard, taking down the confused, blind thugs, one by one with terrifying precision. In the center of the dark yard, Roderick found Silas Crowe trying to quietly slip away. The 2 underworld kings faced each other. No words were needed. Crowe lunged forward with a hidden blade. Roderick simply stepped inside the strike. A brutal twist of the arm. A sharp, sickening crack. Crowe hit the dirt, pinned, gasping for air. The reign of Silas Crowe was completely over in seconds. The yard went quiet. The police sirens were already wailing far in the distance. Roderick walked away from the fallen boss. He found Delia standing bravely by the breaker box. She was breathing hard, her hands were dirty with grease. But her eyes were fierce. He looked at her, a profound, silent respect passing deeply between them. Later that night, after the chaos finally faded, they sat in a small quiet diner at the dark edge of the city. The flickering yellow lights hummed above them. 2 cups of bitter black coffee sat untouched on the cheap Formica table. The powerful, terrifying mob boss. The struggling, working-class widow. 2 completely different worlds. But the deep pain in their eyes was exactly the same. Roderick traced the rim of his ceramic cup. He finally spoke softly. He told her about the dark. About losing his parents to violence. About the searing rage that almost swallowed him whole as a boy. He told her how Margaret, his grandmother, had pulled him out of the abyss. She taught him that even in a cruel, bloody world, pure kindness exists. She was his only anchor to humanity. When he almost lost her on that bridge, the old darkness came roaring back to consume him. He looked directly into Delia's eyes. He said she did not just save an old woman's life that day. She saved his very soul from falling back into the pit. Delia listened quietly. Her heart ached for him. She understood that kind of crushing grief. She leaned forward. She told him about Caleb. About the morning he kissed her forehead, put on his yellow hard hat, and never came back home. She told him about the crushing, unfair weight of the system. The greedy corporations that treat human blood as just the simple cost of doing business. She had to build a thick wall around her heart just to survive, just to keep Posey safe. They sat there in the quiet hum of the diner until the sun came up. 2 broken people, both crushed by the heavy world, both trying desperately to piece it back together. There were no grand declarations of love, no cheap Hollywood romance. It was much deeper and more profound than that. It was raw, honest human connection. It was the quiet healing of old, invisible scars for the first time in years. Neither of them felt completely alone in the dark. Weeks passed. The heavy storm finally settled over Holloway City. The corrupt board at Brightline Power had been aggressively purged. The frantic news cycle had moved on. Delia was at home, enjoying a quiet, peaceful morning with Posey. There was a sharp knock on the door. A courier handed her a thick, heavy envelope. Inside was a formal legal document and a personal letter. Roderick Vance had not just exposed the corrupt Gerald Ashworth. He had bought the entire power company. He completely tore out the rotten roots of the corporate greed that had plagued the city grid for decades. But the letter was not a financial payout. It was not pity charity. It was a serious offer, a binding job contract. He wanted her, the exact woman the broken system had tried to crush. He wanted her to take the highest executive position in the new safety division, chief safety officer for the entire regional electrical grid. The ironclad contract gave her absolute, unquestionable authority. She had the power to halt any dangerous project. She had the power to demand the best safety equipment. She had the power to fire any manager who dared to cut corners on human life. Roderick wrote that a system is only truly safe when it is run by someone who refuses to bow to corporate pressure, someone who deeply knows the real, human cost of a rusted bolt. Delia read the printed words. The paper blurred before her eyes. Hot tears fell down her cheeks. These were not tears of fresh grief. They were tears of pure, overwhelming release. The agonizing, endless loop of pain that started the day her husband died was finally closing. She could not save Caleb. But now, she was being handed the real power to save thousands of other husbands, other fathers, other sons. She was turning her deepest, darkest tragedy into her greatest weapon for good. She grabbed a pen and signed the paper. 3 months later, the sun was shining a brilliant, clear blue over a massive, newly rebuilt substation. The very place where the terrible accident happened. Now it was a shining fortress of safety. The cables were heavy and secure. The warning alarms were functional. A small, joyous celebration was happening. Workers were laughing freely. Families were eating barbecue. Delia stood proudly in the center of it all. She wore a crisp, white hard hat, a gleaming badge of authority on her jacket. She was smiling, truly, deeply smiling from her soul. Posey was running happily through the green grass, chasing a yellow butterfly, safe, protected, happy. A luxury car pulled up slowly to the curb. The door opened. Margaret Vance stepped out carefully. She walked with a cane, but her eyes were bright and full of life. She walked straight to Delia. The two strong women did not shake hands. They embraced, a long, deep, emotional hug holding the heavy weight of a life saved and a life completely changed. Margaret whispered her profound thanks. She said, she always knew the true light was still out there in the world. In the distance, parked quietly under the deep shade of an old oak tree, the black armored SUV sat idling. The tinted window rolled down just a few inches. Roderick Vance watched the beautiful scene unfold. He saw the happy workers. He saw his healthy grandmother. He saw the brave woman who had fought a war for a total stranger. A faint, incredibly rare smile crossed his stoic, hardened face. He did not step out of the vehicle. He did not need the public applause. He was the quiet guardian in the shadows. He tapped the thick glass, and the car slowly drove away, slipping back into the unseen currents of the city. Marsh's story is not just a thrilling tale of survival against the odds. It is a powerful testament to the undeniable power of human dignity. It teaches us a vital healing lesson. True strength is not measured by the size of your bank account or the fancy titles on your office door. True strength is having the raw courage to do what is right, even when the whole world tells you to walk away. It reminds us that every single working person is a valuable human life, deserving of deep respect, absolute safety, and a fair chance to go home to their family at the end of the day. A human life is never just a line item on a corporate budget. Every person has value, every worker has dignity, and sometimes one single act of raw, uncalculated kindness can ignite a blazing fire that burns down a corrupt empire. We must protect each other. We must stand up for the vulnerable. We must refuse to let greed win. If Delia's journey resonated with your heart today, please hit that like button to let us know. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that fighting for what is right is never a waste of time. Your voice matters. Your actions matter. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss our next incredible journey into the resilience of the human spirit. Leave a comment below and tell us what you would have done in her shoes. Would you have cut the wire? We read every single comment. Thank you for spending your time listening to this story. Keep fighting your everyday battles. Keep your head held high. Show kindness to strangers. And never, ever let the dark take your light. 6 months passed. The honeymoon phase of corporate justice did not last long. Holloway City was a massive, rusted, incredibly stubborn machine. It was built on decades of deeply ingrained bad habits. Delia Marsh was now the chief safety officer of the entire regional grid. She did not sit in a soft, expensive leather chair. She did not hide in a warm, climate-controlled glass tower. She wore a bright, neon high-visibility jacket. She wore heavy, scuffed, steel-toed work boots. She spent her days out in the freezing, unforgiving mud. Winter had arrived with a brutal, punishing vengeance. It was the absolute coldest December on the city's historical record. Thick ice coated the towering skyscrapers like heavy, medieval armor. Delia was personally auditing the massive, labyrinth-like underground subway system. She walked the dark tracks with a heavy flashlight. She found a terrifying, carefully hidden secret. The main electrical junction for the incredibly crowded Red Line transit was completely rotten. The thick rubber insulation was brutally stripped away. The heavy, exposed copper cables were literally swimming in leaking, filthy groundwater. It was a massive, undeniable fire hazard. A single, stray spark could ignite the decades of ancient, accumulated grease. It could instantly trap tens of thousands of morning commuters in a burning, suffocating, inescapable concrete tunnel. Gerald Ashworth had deliberately ignored it for years, just to save a few $1,000s on his ledger. Delia did not hesitate for a single second. She used her absolute, newly acquired executive authority. She walked straight to the main control panel. She slammed her heavy, gloved hand on the emergency kill switch. She completely shut down the entire Red Line. No trains, no movement, no exceptions whatsoever. She ordered an immediate, total, and highly expensive rebuild of the entire underground junction. The corporate elites of the city were absolutely furious. Elias Sterling was the billionaire transit tycoon who owned the maintenance contracts. He lost tens of millions of dollars in a single, chaotic afternoon. But Sterling was not just a greedy, white-collar businessman. He was deeply, violently, and irredeemably corrupt. He secretly rented the dark, unmonitored blind spots in the transit tunnels to a violent international smuggling syndicate. The syndicate was led by a ruthless, ghostly figure named Victor. Victor moved highly illegal, untraceable military weapons through the dark tunnels, while the innocent city slept above. Delia had just unknowingly slammed a heavy, locked steel door on a multi-million-dollar criminal empire. Victor did not care about electrical safety regulations. He only cared about his blood money. He decided the new chief safety officer was a massive, unacceptable problem, and in his dark world, problems simply had to die. He ordered a professional, highly coordinated hit. He wanted it to look exactly like a tragic, unavoidable workplace accident. It was 2:00 in the morning. Delia was deep underground. She was leading a small, dedicated, highly skilled crew of union electricians. They were standing knee-deep in freezing, filthy, black water. They were physically pulling heavy, brand-new cables through the dark, damp, echoing tunnel. The dead air smelled like rust and old, burnt ozone. The men were physically exhausted, but they trusted her completely. They knew she was fighting for their lives. Suddenly, the massive, humming emergency floodlights clicked off. The entire miles-long tunnel plunged into absolute, pitch-black, suffocating darkness. The steady, reassuring hum of the massive ventilation fans completely died. The silence was instantly terrifying. Delia grabbed her heavy shoulder radio. She pressed the transmit button. She called up to the surface dispatch team. Nothing, just dead crackling, empty static. The radio frequencies were being actively, professionally jammed. Delia felt a cold, hard, familiar knot tighten in her stomach. She knew the mechanical grid perfectly. She knew the difference between a random, unfortunate grid failure and deliberate, tactical sabotage. She knew they were completely cut off from the surface world. 4 miles above them, the city was sleeping, but in a heavily fortified, bulletproof glass penthouse. Roderick Vance was wide awake. His secure phone vibrated violently on his desk. His underground intelligence network never, ever slept. A terrified, breathless informant whispered the terrifying truth. Victor's heavily armed mercenaries had forcefully breached the closed Red Line access grates. They were moving underground. They were actively hunting Delia in the pitch-black dark. Roderick's blood turned to pure, absolute ice. The calm, calculating, untouchable Mafia boss instantly vanished. The man who had finally learned how to care about another human being took over. He realized the unbelievably brave woman who brought light back into his dark world was currently trapped in a concrete cage. She was trapped with professional, remorseless killers. He did not call the corrupt city police department. The police would take hours to navigate the bureaucratic red tape. They would demand warrants. They would be too late. He armed himself immediately. He strapped a heavy Kevlar tactical vest, tightly over his chest. He chambered a round in his weapon. He rallied his most elite, ruthless, fiercely loyal enforcers. A fleet of black, heavily armored SUVs tore out of the underground garage. They smashed violently through the frozen, empty city streets. They completely ignored the red traffic lights. They drove like desperate demons running straight from hell. It was a desperate, violent, incredibly high-stakes race against the ticking clock. Down in the freezing, flooded tunnel, Delia's crew began to panic. They were honest, hard-working fathers and sons. They were highly trained electricians, not combat soldiers. They heard the terrifying sound echoing down the concrete walls, heavy. Synchronized combat boots splashing rhythmically in the deep water. They were getting closer. Victor's mercenaries were moving in incredibly fast. They wore advanced, expensive thermal vision goggles. They carried suppressed, fully automatic rifles. They owned the darkness. Delia completely refused to be a helpless, screaming victim. She refused to let these innocent, hard-working men die on her watch. She vividly remembered Caleb. She remembered the devastating, soul-crushing pain of a family permanently shattered by corporate greed and senseless violence. She pulled her heavy, rubber-insulated wire cutters from her leather belt. She gathered her terrified, shaking men. She whispered sharp, clear, incredibly confident orders. She was the captain of this ship. They retreated quickly and quietly into the narrow, abandoned maintenance shafts. The heavily armed mercenaries moved closer. The eerie, bright green glow of their night vision lenses pierced the absolute dark. But Delia was a seasoned master of this specific environment. She knew the electrical grid better than anyone currently alive in the city. She blindly navigated the dark walls. She found a massive, dangerously bypassed high-voltage capacitor bank. She knew exactly how much raw, lethal, unfiltered electrical power was currently sleeping inside that rusted steel box. It was a sleeping dragon. She told her men to crouch down low. She ordered them to cover their eyes tightly. She waited patiently in the terrifying dark. She listened to the boots. She waited until the squad of mercenaries was standing perfectly still in a massive, connected puddle of standing water. Then she swung her heavy steel wrench with everything she had. She violently smashed the primary containment lock. She reached in with her insulated tools. She forcefully crossed the live, thick copper feeds. A massive, blinding roaring arc of pure blue electricity exploded in the confined tunnel. It was incredibly loud. It was brighter than the midday sun. The intense, sudden flash of unfiltered light instantly overloaded the mercenaries' sensitive thermal goggles. The delicate electronic lenses burned out completely. The killers screamed in sudden, agonizing pain. They ripped the useless gear off their faces. They were completely, temporarily blinded by the brilliant, aggressive light. Delia had just turned the city's broken infrastructure into a massive, highly effective defensive weapon. She proved in that split second that the working class is never truly defenseless when they use their minds. At that exact chaotic, blinding moment, the heavy steel security gates at the tunnel entrance blew open. The explosion shook the underground foundation. Roderick Vance and his heavily armed men flooded into the underground labyrinth. The ensuing gunfight was incredibly fast. It was brutally, ruthlessly efficient. Roderick moved through the smoke and water like a hunting shadow. His men used precise, disciplined, overwhelming military tactics. They completely overwhelmed the blinded, confused, screaming mercenaries in a matter of seconds. Victor, the ruthless syndicate leader, tried to completely abandon his dying men. He tried to desperately escape through a rusted, vertical side access ladder, but Roderick was already waiting for him at the top of the concrete shaft. The two massive underworld kings fiercely clashed in the dark. Victor was a highly trained, incredibly lethal killer, but Roderick fought with something far more dangerous than just physical technique or muscle. He fought with a desperate, primal, burning need to protect. He fought for the brave woman who made him actually feel human again. Roderick violently shattered Victor's defensive guard. He brutally disarmed him with a sickening crack. He pinned the ruthless smuggler violently against the cold, wet concrete wall. The massive, untouchable underground smuggling ring was completely, permanently destroyed in less than 5 chaotic minutes. Roderick left Victor tightly bound in heavy zip ties for the federal authorities to find. He immediately ran down the smoky, flooded tunnel. The thick smell of burnt ozone and gunpowder was absolutely blinding. He shouted her name into the dark. He found Delia. She was covered head to toe in thick, black grease. Her bright high-visibility jacket was torn and soaked. Her hands were deeply bruised and bleeding, but she was standing incredibly tall. She was fiercely, bravely shielding her terrified crew of electricians behind her own body. She still had her heavy wrench gripped tightly in her hand. Roderick stopped dead in his tracks. The freezing water swirled around his boots. He looked at her with absolute, unfiltered, breathless awe. He suddenly realized a profound truth. She did not actually need him to be her knight in shining armor. She had bravely fought the absolute worst monsters in the dark all by herself. She held the dangerous line against pure, concentrated evil. Roderick slowly lowered his heavy weapon. He walked up to her, splashing through the water. He gently, carefully wrapped his heavy, warm winter coat around her freezing, shivering shoulders. They did not need to speak a single word. The profound, overwhelming, incredibly deep respect between them was significantly louder than any gunshot. The morning sun majestically rose over a freezing, beautiful Holloway city. The winter sky was a brilliant, crystal clear, icy blue. Millions of tired morning commuters boarded the city buses and the alternate train lines. They drank their hot coffee in paper cups. They quietly read their morning newspapers. They were completely, blissfully safe. They had absolutely no idea that a brutal, violent war was fiercely fought underground, just to protect their daily commute. Elias Sterling, the corrupt billionaire tycoon, was violently dragged out of his massive, incredibly expensive mansion in cold silver handcuffs. The deep transit corruption was violently, permanently ripped out by the very roots. Delia Marsh sat quietly in a warm, local working-class diner. Roderick Vance sat quietly across from her in a vinyl booth. Two completely, vastly different people. One ruled the dangerous, violent shadows. The other fiercely protected the bright light. But they were deeply, permanently bound by a shared, unbreakable, beautiful mission to completely protect the vulnerable from the incredibly greedy. This specific chapter of Delia's incredible life teaches us a profound, absolutely enduring lesson. Real, undeniable power is not holding a loaded gun. Real power is not hoarding billions of dirty dollars in an offshore bank account. Real power is using your hard-earned knowledge and your raw courage to protect the innocent people around you. We must fiercely, continuously value the invisible, hard-working people who keep our world running safely every single day. The electricians, the plumbers, the line workers. We must demand absolute, unforgiving corporate accountability. You do not have to be a billionaire or a comic book superhero to permanently change the world. You just have to be brave enough to do your specific job with absolute, unbreakable integrity. You have to be incredibly willing to stand in the freezing, terrifying dark and firmly hold the line for someone else. Healing a completely broken system takes immense daily courage. It takes every day. Normal people who simply refuse to look the other way when things get dangerous. Whenever you feel incredibly small, vividly, remember the working-class widow with the heavy wrench. Remember that your individual voice deeply matters. Remember that your personal courage can spark a massive light that absolutely blinds the darkness. If this continuing story fueled your human spirit today, please leave a quick like. Share this specific video with the incredibly hard workers in your life who never, ever get enough credit. Subscribe to keep this amazing journey going. Leave a deep comment and clearly tell us how you hold the line in your own life. Keep fiercely fighting, keep aggressively protecting each other, and never, ever let the cold shadows win. The freezing winter finally retreated. The heavy suffocating humidity of early summer aggressively swallowed Holloway City. Delia Marsh did not take a vacation. She did not rest in her air-conditioned executive office. She was out on the massive, sprawling, rusted concrete of the commercial shipping docks. The Holloway port was an incredibly dangerous, massive industrial beast. It was the beating, bleeding economic heart of the entire eastern seaboard. Thousands of exhausted, overworked union stevedores aggressively moved millions of tons of heavy cargo every single day. Nathaniel Thorne completely owned the massive docks. He was a ruthless, deeply arrogant billionaire shipping magnate. He completely viewed the tired, sweating dock workers as cheap, easily replaceable biological machines. Delia was aggressively conducting a massive, unannounced safety audit of the deep water loading zones. The heavy air smelled intensely of diesel fuel and salty, rotting seaweed. A massive, terrifying summer hurricane was rapidly, aggressively brewing directly off the dark coast. The sky was turning a deeply bruised, violent purple. The harbor master had aggressively ordered a total, mandatory shutdown of all heavy loading operations. But Nathaniel Thorne completely ignored the official safety warnings. He aggressively ordered his exhausted men to continue loading massive, heavy steel shipping containers onto a massive freighter. Delia aggressively inspected the specific cargo manifest. Her blood turned completely to pure, freezing ice. The heavy containers were totally filled with highly volatile, deeply unstable industrial chemical solvents. The incredibly toxic chemicals were completely hypersensitive to extreme physical movement and massive temperature drops. Loading them during a violent, aggressive hurricane was absolute, undeniable suicidal madness. If one single heavy container violently dropped, the massive explosion would instantly vaporize the entire port. Thousands of innocent, hard-working fathers and sons would instantly, violently die. Delia aggressively marched straight into the massive, glass-walled harbor control tower. Nathaniel Thorne was standing arrogantly by the massive windows. He was wearing an incredibly expensive, tailored Italian suit. He was loudly yelling at his terrified, sweating logistics managers. Delia violently slammed the red cargo manifest directly onto his pristine, polished desk. She aggressively demanded an immediate, total, mandatory halt to the dangerous loading operations. She deeply told him the volatile chemicals were already actively destabilizing in the heavy, dropping barometric pressure. Nathaniel Thorne did not yell at her. He just smiled a cold, terrifying, incredibly condescending smile. He deeply told her she was vastly overstepping her legal executive boundaries. He aggressively told her the lucrative international shipping contract was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He absolutely refused to lose his massive corporate bonus just because a few cheap workers might accidentally get hurt. He aggressively snapped his manicured fingers. A dozen massive, heavily armed private security contractors aggressively stepped out of the dark shadows. They were ruthless, highly paid corporate mercenaries. They aggressively placed their heavy hands on their holstered weapons. Thorne coldly told Delia to immediately leave his private property. He aggressively told her the heavy loading cranes would continue operating until the massive ship was completely full. The terrified, exhausted union dockworkers outside were aggressively forced back to work at literal gunpoint. They desperately needed the small paychecks to feed their starving families. They were completely trapped between a violent, deadly hurricane and the aggressive, heavily armed mercenaries. Delia did not aggressively back down. She did not run away from the heavily armed corporate thugs. She absolutely refused to let innocent, exhausted men die for a billionaire's greedy bonus. She aggressively ran straight out of the control tower. The massive, violent hurricane aggressively slammed into the dark coastline. The deafening, howling wind aggressively ripped at her bright neon safety jacket. The freezing, heavy rain violently blinded her vision. The massive towering steel loading cranes were aggressively swaying violently in the extreme hurricane force winds. The exhausted crane operators were desperately, frantically, trying to load the massive, incredibly dangerous chemical containers. Delia knew she had to aggressively, permanently stop the massive machines. She completely bypassed the heavily guarded main electrical subpanels. She aggressively ran straight toward the massive, high-voltage primary junction box located underneath the roaring, violent waves of the main concrete pier. The rising, freezing ocean water aggressively battered her heavy boots. She aggressively pulled her heavy, insulated steel wrench. She violently smashed the heavy locking mechanism. She aggressively reached into the massive, sparking nest of high-voltage cables. She expertly, aggressively crossed the massive primary feeds. A blinding, deafening arc of pure blue electricity violently exploded in the dark. She aggressively, completely short-circuited the entire massive harbor grid. The towering, heavy steel loading cranes violently shuddered and completely, instantly died. The incredibly dangerous loading operation was permanently, aggressively halted, but the heavily armed corporate mercenaries had aggressively seen her. They aggressively drew their heavy weapons. They viciously ran down the wet concrete pier to permanently silence the stubborn safety officer. Delia was completely trapped at the edge of the violent, churning ocean. The heavily armed mercenaries aggressively raised their lethal weapons, but they absolutely never got the chance to fire a single shot. A massive, deafening, terrifying roar aggressively overpowered the violent hurricane. Dozens of incredibly heavy, massive, 18-wheeler Union transport trucks aggressively smashed through the main harbor security gates. They violently drove straight onto the massive concrete pier. The heavy trucks aggressively formed a massive, impenetrable steel wall, completely blocking the terrifying mercenaries. Roderick Vance aggressively stepped out of the lead heavy truck. He was not alone. Hundreds of angry, incredibly exhausted, heavily muscular Union dockworkers stood aggressively behind him. They were holding heavy steel pipes. They were holding massive chain wrenches. Roderick did not draw a weapon. He simply stared aggressively at Nathaniel Thorne's terrified, highly paid mercenaries. He deeply radiated an absolute, terrifying, cold aura of pure, unadulterated violence. The Mafia boss and the working-class union had aggressively formed a massive, undeniable, unbreakable alliance. The heavily armed mercenaries slowly, terrified, aggressively lowered their weapons. They were highly paid killers, but they were absolutely not ready to fight a massive, angry army of desperate, united men. Nathaniel Thorne aggressively watched his massive, corrupt empire completely crumble from the high control tower. He realized absolute, undeniable power does not come from a massive bank account. It comes from the fierce, unbreakable solidarity of the working class. Roderick walked aggressively through the heavy rain. He deeply reached out his hand. He pulled Delia safely away from the violent, crashing edge of the dark pier. The massive, violent hurricane finally broke the absolute next morning. The bright, warm sun aggressively pierced the heavy dark clouds. The massive harbor was completely, undeniably safe. The incredibly volatile chemical containers were never dangerously loaded. Nathaniel Thorne was aggressively dragged out of his luxury control tower in cold, heavy steel handcuffs. The Federal Environmental Protection Agencies aggressively seized his entire, corrupt shipping empire. The exhausted, brave Union dockworkers deeply cheered as the greedy billionaire was violently shoved into a police cruiser. Delia Marsh and Roderick Vance stood quietly on the wet, concrete edge of the massive harbor. The aggressive, violent storm had finally passed. They had deeply, successfully protected thousands of completely innocent, hardworking lives. This massive, incredibly intense chapter of our continuing story deeply teaches us an absolute, profound lesson. Corporate greed will always aggressively try to isolate and violently divide the working class. The wealthy elites desperately want you to feel completely weak, entirely alone, and deeply powerless. But true, undeniable strength is absolute, fierce solidarity. When every day, hard-working people aggressively stand together, they become an absolutely unstoppable, terrifying force of nature. We must fiercely protect the exhausted people who literally build and move our massive world. Human life and human dignity must absolutely always come before a greedy corporate deadline. If this incredibly powerful, deeply human story fueled your inner fire today, please aggressively smash that like button. Share this absolutely vital video with everyone who aggressively works hard to feed their family. Subscribe to our channel to endlessly continue this massive, deeply healing journey of human resilience. Drop an intense, aggressive comment below. Tell us exactly how you fiercely support the hardworking people in your own community. Keep your inner spirit incredibly fierce. Keep fiercely protecting each other, and never, ever let the greedy giants violently crush your incredible light. The suffocating heat of summer finally broke. A cold, biting autumn wind swept aggressively through Holloway City. The dying leaves scraped across the cracked pavement. Delia Marsh was standing in the freezing mud. She was aggressively inspecting the massive foundation of the new Holloway Public Hospital. It was a massive, multi-million-dollar expansion project. It was specifically designed to treat the poorest, most vulnerable sick children in the entire city. The massive steel skeleton was already rising into the gray sky, but Delia was not looking up at the shiny steel. She was looking deep down into the dark, massive concrete foundation trenches. She used her heavy steel tools to chip away a fresh core sample. Her trained eyes instantly saw the terrifying, deadly truth. The massive concrete pillars were crumbling. The heavy steel rebar inside was incredibly thin, heavily rusted, and completely uncertified. Julian Croft was the incredibly wealthy, deeply corrupt billionaire property developer in charge of the project. He had deliberately bought cheap, counterfeit construction materials from illegal black markets. He was actively pocketing millions of dollars of critical public health care funds. Delia felt a cold, paralyzing terror grip her chest. She did not just see bad concrete. She saw a massive, catastrophic future disaster. If a minor earthquake hit, or even a severe winter storm, the entire massive hospital wing would violently collapse. Hundreds of sick, completely innocent children would be instantly, tragically crushed under thousands of tons of cheap rubble. Julian Croft was literally building a massive, towering graveyard just to buy another luxury yacht. Delia aggressively marched straight to the luxurious, climate-controlled, temporary executive trailer on the massive site. Julian Croft was casually sitting behind a pristine, glass desk. He was wearing an incredibly expensive, tailored wool suit. He was quietly sipping hot, imported coffee. Delia violently slammed the crumbling, terrifying concrete core sample directly onto his clean desk. She fiercely demanded an absolute, immediate, mandatory halt to the massive construction project. She aggressively ordered a total demolition and rebuild of the heavily compromised foundation. Julian Croft did not panic. He did not look surprised. He simply smiled a cold, incredibly arrogant, deeply sociopathic smile. He quietly told her that the massive, highly publicized ribbon-cutting ceremony was next month. The corrupt city politicians desperately needed a massive public relations victory. He aggressively told her that she was a completely insignificant, easily replaceable, highly annoying obstacle. He slowly stood up. He coldly signaled his four massive, heavily armed, corporate fixers standing in the shadows. They did not wear standard security uniforms. They wore heavy tactical gear hidden under thick coats. Croft coldly ordered them to physically throw Delia deep into the massive main foundation trench. He aggressively ordered the heavy machine operators to immediately start pumping the thousands of gallons of wet, heavy concrete. He desperately wanted her violently buried alive. He wanted her completely silenced under 50 feet of solid, uncertified rock. He wanted the terrifying truth permanently hidden at the very bottom of the massive hospital. The massive corporate fixers aggressively grabbed Delia by her bright neon safety jacket. They violently dragged her out into the freezing, howling wind. They aggressively threw her over the steep, muddy edge of the massive foundation trench. She violently hit the freezing, hard earth at the very bottom. The breath was completely knocked out of her tired lungs. High above her, the massive, deafening diesel engines of the heavy concrete pump trucks aggressively roared to life. A thick, incredibly heavy, suffocating river of wet gray concrete violently poured down into the dark trench. It was moving incredibly fast. It was aggressively burying her boots. It was incredibly heavy and terrifyingly cold. Delia Marsh absolutely refused to be a passive, screaming victim. She fiercely remembered Caleb's tragic death. She completely refused to let another massive, greedy corporation violently steal her life. The wet concrete was rapidly rising to her waist. It was aggressively crushing her legs. She desperately fought through the thick, suffocating sludge. She aggressively reached a massive, exposed bundle of high-voltage, temporary electrical wires powering the heavy pump relays. She violently pulled her heavy, rubber-insulated wire cutters. She completely ignored the terrifying, rapidly rising wet concrete. She fiercely stripped the thick black wires with her bare, freezing hands. She aggressively bypassed the heavy grounding circuits. She violently slammed the live electrical feeds directly against the wet, heavy steel rebar frame. A massive, blinding, deafening arc of pure blue electricity violently exploded in the dark trench. The massive power surge violently traveled up the wet steel lines. It aggressively hit the heavy pump trucks above. The massive diesel engines violently shrieked, sparked, and completely died. The terrifying, heavy flow of suffocating concrete instantly, permanently stopped. But Delia was still completely trapped deep in the freezing, hardening concrete. She could not aggressively pull her heavy legs out. Up on the muddy surface, Julian Croft aggressively screamed at his terrified men to manually restart the broken pumps. But a massive, deafening roar aggressively echoed across the freezing construction site. It was absolutely not a police siren. Dozens of incredibly massive, heavily armored black SUVs and heavy Union tow trucks violently smashed through the chain-link security gates. Roderick Vance aggressively stepped out of the lead heavy vehicle. He did not bring lethal guns to a massive construction site. He brought raw, undeniable, aggressive industrial power. Hundreds of angry, incredibly muscular, heavily equipped Union construction workers violently flooded out of the trucks. They aggressively surrounded Croft's terrified corporate fixers. Roderick Vance aggressively marched straight up to the arrogant billionaire. He violently grabbed Croft by his expensive wool collar. He aggressively threw the screaming, corrupt developer face first into the freezing, deep mud. Roderick completely ignored the terrified executive. He aggressively jumped straight down into the freezing, deep concrete trench. His massive, highly trained men fiercely followed him. They aggressively used heavy steel shovels, but they used their bare, bleeding hands. They desperately, violently dug through the incredibly heavy, rapidly hardening concrete. Roderick fiercely grabbed Delia's freezing hands. He violently pulled, with every single ounce of his massive, immense strength. The heavy suction of the wet concrete violently fought back, but Roderick absolutely refused to let her go. With a massive aggressive heave, they violently pulled her completely free from the freezing, deadly trap. She collapsed heavily against his warm chest, exhausted but incredibly, completely alive. The corrupt Julian Croft was aggressively dragged away in heavy, cold silver handcuffs by federal construction for fraud investigators on live local television. His incredibly massive, deeply greedy offshore bank accounts were completely, permanently seized. The dangerous, corrupt, heavily compromised hospital foundation was violently demolished. It was completely, beautifully rebuilt from the absolute ground up with the finest, safest, incredibly strong premium steel and concrete. Delia and Roderick stood quietly on the massive, safe, newly finished rooftop of the beautiful children's hospital. The crisp, clean autumn sun beautifully warmed their tired faces. They looked quietly out over the vast, sprawling, incredibly beautiful city. They had deeply aggressively protected the absolute, most fragile, innocent lives in the entire massive metropolis. This incredibly powerful, deeply human chapter of our massive story teaches us an absolutely vital, unbreakable lesson. The true, undeniable strength of any massive society is exactly how it fiercely protects its absolute most vulnerable citizens. Healing our broken world completely starts with a strong, honest, uncorrupted foundation. Human life and deep, pure safety must absolutely always come before a greedy corporate profit margin. True, undeniable power is the incredibly brave, exhausted working class, fiercely, holding the absolute line in the terrifying dark. You absolutely have the massive power to aggressively stand up for the truth. You just have to be incredibly brave enough to completely refuse to be buried by the lies. If this deeply emotional, incredibly tense story completely fueled your human soul today, please aggressively hit that like button. Share this absolutely vital video with the exhausted, brave people who fiercely build and protect your local community. Subscribe to our channel to endlessly continue this massive, deeply inspiring journey of absolute human resilience. Drop an incredibly passionate comment below. Tell us exactly how you fiercely build a strong, honest foundation in your own beautiful life. Keep your inner fire aggressively burning. Keep fiercely protecting the innocent. And absolutely never let the cold, greedy shadows violently bury your beautiful warm light. The freezing winter finally broke. A brutal, unpredictable spring aggressively slammed into Holloway City. The massive, towering Holloway Narrows suspension bridge was the absolute lifeline of the entire region. Millions of heavy commuter cars aggressively crossed the massive steel span every single week. Delia Marsh did not sit in her warm safety office. She was out on the massive, aggressively vibrating steel cables. She was suspended hundreds of feet above the dark, freezing, roaring river. She was conducting an aggressive, unannounced structural integrity audit. She chipped away the thick, freshly painted silver coating on a primary suspension joint. Her heart violently dropped in her chest. The massive steel cables underneath were completely, heavily rusted. They were incredibly thin. They were heavily compromised counterfeit metal. Preston Cale owned the massive, lucrative municipal steel contracts. He was an incredibly wealthy, deeply corrupt industrial billionaire. He had aggressively, illegally imported cheap, completely uncertified steel. He quietly pocketed hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars. He aggressively painted over the deadly rust to hide his massive crime. Delia aggressively looked at the heavy, crawling bumper to bumper, traffic miles below her. She instantly knew the horrifying, undeniable truth. The incredibly heavy, massive bridge was actively, violently tearing itself apart. If a sudden heavy spring windstorm hit the massive span, the entire structure would violently, catastrophically collapse. Thousands of innocent, hardworking commuters would violently plummet into the freezing, dark river. It would be the absolute deadliest structural disaster in the city's entire history. Preston Cale was trading thousands of innocent human lives for a massive corporate bonus. Delia fiercely marched straight to the massive, heavily fortified Bridge Authority Control Center. Preston Cale was casually sitting behind a massive, polished glass desk. He was wearing an incredibly expensive, tailored designer suit. He was quietly sipping expensive, imported sparkling water. Delia violently slammed the rusted, heavily compromised steel core samples directly onto his clean desk. She fiercely demanded an immediate, total mandatory evacuation of the massive suspension bridge. She aggressively ordered a total shutdown of all heavy commercial traffic. Preston Cale did not look surprised. He did not show a single ounce of human guilt. He simply smiled a cold, deeply sociopathic, incredibly arrogant smile. He quietly told her that aggressively closing the massive bridge would completely ruin his highly anticipated corporate IPO. He aggressively told her that he absolutely refused to lose his massive billionaire status just because a few cheap cables might snap. He coldly pressed a hidden security button under his expensive desk. 6 massive, heavily armed, highly paid private military contractors aggressively stepped out of the dark control room shadows. They were ruthless, silent, heavily equipped killers. Cale coldly ordered his terrifying mercenaries to forcefully drag Delia deep down into the massive, hollow concrete anchorages at the very base of the bridge. He aggressively wanted her violently locked inside the massive, pitch-black structural hollows. He deeply wanted her to be violently crushed by the massive, shifting steel counterweights. He wanted her terrifying structural reports permanently buried in the dark, roaring concrete tomb. The massive, heavily armed corporate mercenaries aggressively grabbed Dalia. They violently dragged her down hundreds of incredibly steep, dark, freezing concrete stairs. They aggressively shoved her into the massive, echoing, terrifying anchorage chamber. At the absolute bottom of the massive bridge pillar, the air was incredibly thick, freezing, and deafeningly loud. The massive, heavy steel traffic above created a terrifying, continuous roar. They violently slammed the massive, heavy steel vault door securely behind her. They aggressively locked the heavy deadbolts. Dalia was completely trapped in the terrifying, freezing dark, the incredibly massive, heavy concrete walls around her were violently groaning. The massive steel counterweights were aggressively shifting and grinding directly above her head. The heavy, rusted cables were actively snapping one by one with deafening, terrifying cracks. The massive bridge was slowly starting to violently fail. But Dalia absolutely refused to quietly die in the dark. She fiercely remembered the beautiful, innocent faces of the working-class families trapped in the heavy traffic above. She completely refused to let an incredibly evil, greedy billionaire violently murder them. She aggressively felt her way through the freezing, pitch-black dark. She fiercely found the massive, high-voltage manual override terminal for the bridge's emergency blockade gates. The heavy steel terminal was tightly locked with a massive, encrypted corporate keypad. Dalia aggressively pulled her heavy, rubber-insulated wire cutters from her deep belt. She violently smashed the thick plastic casing. She aggressively stripped the incredibly thick, live high-voltage power lines with her bare, shaking hands. She fiercely, aggressively crossed the massive electrical feeds directly into the heavy blockade relay. A massive, blinding, deafening arc of pure blue electricity violently exploded in the dark, vibrating chamber. The massive, violent electrical surge completely bypassed Preston Kale's greedy corporate lockdown. Up on the massive highway, the incredibly heavy, solid steel emergency blockade gates aggressively, violently dropped. The massive red warning sirens aggressively screamed across the entire span. All incoming heavy traffic was instantly, aggressively halted. The fragile, failing bridge was completely saved from further, deadly weight. But down in the dark anchorage, the massive electrical explosion violently knocked Dalia completely backward onto the freezing, hard concrete. She was rapidly, aggressively losing consciousness in the freezing dark. The massive counterweights above her were violently groaning, ready to aggressively collapse. Suddenly, a massive, deafening explosion aggressively ripped the heavy steel vault door completely off its heavy metal hinges. Roderick Vance aggressively threw himself into the terrifying, vibrating chamber. He did not aggressively bring his usual underworld enforcers alone. He fiercely brought dozens of incredibly massive, heavy Union tow trucks and giant snowplows. They had aggressively, violently stormed the bridge entrance, completely blocking the corrupt mercenaries. Roderick had absolutely decimated Kale's heavily armed, highly paid killers in a matter of incredibly violent, chaotic seconds. Roderick fiercely navigated the freezing, terrifying dark. He aggressively grabbed Dalia's freezing, limp body. He violently pulled her tightly against his massive, incredibly warm chest. He aggressively carried her out of the terrifying, collapsing tomb and straight up into the crisp, clean, incredibly beautiful spring air. His heavily armed union workers aggressively cheered as he brought her into the bright, warm sunlight. The entire bridge structure fiercely groaned, but the innocent people were already safely walking away. The incredibly corrupt steel magnate, Preston Kale, was aggressively dragged out of his luxurious control room in freezing, heavy silver handcuffs by furious federal agents. His incredibly massive, deeply greedy industrial empire was completely, permanently dismantled by the massive public outrage. The dangerously compromised suspension bridge was immediately shut down. It was entirely, beautifully rebuilt using the absolute safest, strongest honest Union steel. The massive, sprawling city was completely, miraculously saved from absolute, terrifying destruction. Dalia and Roderick stood quietly on the massive, perfectly safe, newly rebuilt pedestrian walkway. The bright, warm sun beautifully reflected off the massive, safe, deep river roaring endlessly far below them. They had deeply, aggressively protected the absolute most essential, vital infrastructure for hundreds of thousands of completely innocent people. This incredibly intense, deeply emotional chapter of our massive story teaches us an absolutely vital, unbreakable, beautiful lesson. structural integrity, absolute safety. And human life must absolutely never be compromised for a greedy corporate profit. The wealthy elites will always aggressively try to use cheap, fake materials to violently hoard the wealth we all desperately need to survive. But true, undeniable power is the incredibly brave. Exhausted working class fiercely, smashing the heavy locks to drop the life-saving safety gates. You absolutely have the massive power to aggressively stand up for the deeply vulnerable people in your own community. You just have to be incredibly brave enough to completely refuse to be crushed in the dark. If this deeply emotional, incredibly tense story completely fueled your human soul today, please aggressively hit that like button. Share this absolutely vital video with the exhausted, brave people who fiercely build and protect your local world. Subscribe to our channel to endlessly continue this massive, deeply inspiring journey of absolute human resilience. Drop an incredibly passionate comment below. Tell us exactly how you fiercely maintain strong integrity in your own beautiful life. Keep your inner fire aggressively burning. Keep fiercely protecting the innocent. And absolutely never let the cold, greedy shadows violently crush your beautiful, warm light. The suffocating heat of late August baked Holloway City. The concrete sidewalks radiated heat like an open oven. People desperately needed clean water. They drank eagerly from public fountains. They opened fire hydrants in the sweltering streets. Delia Marsh was far away from the cooling shade of the city parks. She was deep inside the sprawling, concrete labyrinth of the Holloway Water Purification Plant. It was a massive network of giant steel pipes and deep concrete filtration tanks. It was the absolute lifeline for millions of thirsty, exhausted citizens, but something was terribly, fundamentally wrong with the system. Delia climbed a rusted metal ladder to inspect the primary chemical treatment vats. The massive digital sensors, mounted on the walls, were all glowing a safe, reassuring green, but her highly trained nose caught a horrifying, undeniable scent. The water smelled wrong. It smelled like raw, untreated river algae and heavy, toxic industrial runoff. Arthur Sterling owned the highly lucrative municipal water management contract. He was a ruthless, heavily funded utility billionaire who viewed the city as a spreadsheet. He had quietly, illegally ordered the plant managers to completely bypass the expensive ultraviolet filtration array. He was skipping the crucial heavy metal scrubbing process entirely. He was saving tens of millions of dollars in expensive purification chemicals. He was secretly pumping barely treated, highly contaminated water directly into the public drinking grid. He was literally poisoning the poorest, most vulnerable neighborhoods just to hit his massive quarterly profit margins. If this contaminated water reached the massive residential reservoirs, a catastrophic public health crisis would instantly explode. Thousands of innocent children and elderly citizens would fall violently ill. Sterling was coldly trading human health for a massive corporate bonus. Delia knew she had to stop the toxic flow immediately. Delia marched straight into the pristine, heavily air-conditioned administrative control center. She completely ignored the panicked secretaries. Arthur Sterling was casually sitting behind a sleek, imported glass desk. He wore a perfectly tailored summer suit that cost more than a worker's yearly salary. He was quietly sipping expensive, imported bottled water from a pristine glass. Delia violently slammed her diagnostic tablet and a cloudy glass vial of untreated, toxic water directly onto his desk. She fiercely demanded an immediate, total lockdown of the main distribution valves. She aggressively ordered a massive public boil water advisory for the entire eastern residential district. Sterling did not look surprised. He did not show a single ounce of human guilt. He simply smiled a cold, deeply arrogant, deeply sociopathic smile. He quietly told her the uneducated public would never notice the slight drop in water quality. He callously said the poor neighborhoods were already polluted anyway. He completely refused to lose his massive government contract just because she found a few dirty filters. He calmly pressed a hidden, silent security button under his expensive desk. 4 massive, heavily armed private military contractors stepped out of the dark office shadows. They were ruthless, cold-blooded corporate fixers, wearing heavy tactical gear. Sterling coldly ordered them to physically drag Delia deep down into the subterranean chemical mixing chambers. He wanted her violently locked inside the massive, empty overflow tank. He wanted the heavy steel doors permanently sealed. He wanted her terrifying water quality reports permanently buried when he ordered a deep water system flush. He slowly turned his expensive leather chair back to his glowing computer monitors. He considered the annoying problem completely, permanently solved. The heavily armed mercenaries grabbed Delia roughly by her safety jacket. They violently dragged her down dozens of incredibly steep, slippery concrete stairs. They dragged her deep into the terrifying, absolute bottom of the massive facility. They violently shoved her into the echoing, pitch-black overflow tank. The incredibly heavy steel bulkhead door slammed securely behind her. The heavy electronic deadbolts locked into place with a terrifying, deafening crack. Dalia was completely trapped in the cold, wet, pitch-black dark suddenly. The massive intake valves violently shuddered deep inside the concrete walls. A deafening roar filled the massive steel tank. Sterling was actively, deliberately opening the primary intake pipes. Thousands of gallons of freezing, completely untreated, toxic river water began aggressively pouring into the dark chamber. The water rapidly rose to her knees. It was aggressively rising to her waist. The freezing temperature violently shocked her tired body. The raw, dirty water smelled intensely like toxic sludge and decay, but Dalia absolutely refused to quietly drown in the dark. She fiercely remembered the thousands of thirsty, innocent families in the sweltering city above. She remembered possessive drinking from the kitchen tap. She completely refused to let a greedy billionaire poison them all. She desperately waded through the freezing, rising water. She fiercely felt her way along the dark, slippery concrete wall. She finally found the massive, high-voltage manual override box for the primary emergency flush valves. The heavy steel box was tightly locked behind an incredibly thick, heavy-duty plastic shield. Dalia pulled her heavy steel wrench from her soaked utility belt. She violently smashed the thick casing with all her remaining physical strength. She quickly pulled her rubber-insulated wire cutters. She completely ignored the freezing water, crashing violently against her chest. She fiercely stripped the incredibly thick, live high-voltage cables with her bare, shaking hands. She aggressively crossed the massive electrical feeds directly into the heavy emergency relay switch. A blinding, deafening arc of pure blue electricity violently exploded in the dark, flooding chamber. The massive, violent electrical surge completely bypassed Arthur Sterling's greedy, digital lockdown. Up on the towering exterior of the sprawling facility, the incredibly heavy, solid steel emergency flush gates violently blew wide open. The massive red warning sirens aggressively screamed across the entire industrial sector. Millions of gallons of contaminated, untreated water instantly roared out of the massive safety chutes. The toxic water bypassed the vulnerable city grid entirely. It safely, harmlessly diverted back into the deep industrial spillway. The incredibly fragile municipal reservoirs were instantly, completely protected from the deadly contamination. But down in the dark, sealed tank, the massive electrical explosion knocked Dalia completely backward. She fell incredibly hard into the freezing, deep water. She was rapidly losing consciousness from the bitter cold and the violent physical shock. The massive chamber was still terrifyingly dark. Suddenly, a massive, deafening explosion ripped the incredibly heavy steel bulkhead door completely off its reinforced metal hinges. Roderick Vance fiercely threw himself into the dark, wet, terrifying chamber. He did not bring polite corporate lawyers or standard police officers. He brought raw, undeniable, aggressive union power. Dozens of incredibly massive, heavily equipped union plumbers and local water utility workers had violently stormed the heavily guarded facility gates. They completely overwhelmed the corrupt, highly paid corporate mercenaries. Roderick had absolutely decimated Sterling's heavily armed killers in mere minutes. Roderick desperately navigated the freezing, terrifying, rising water. He fiercely grabbed Dalia's shivering, incredibly weak body. He violently pulled her incredibly tight against his warm, highly protective winter coat. He aggressively carried her completely out of the terrifying, freezing tomb. He carried her straight up into the warm, breathable, incredibly beautiful summer air. His brave, heavily armed union workers cheered loudly as they completely secured the massive filtration valves. The city's essential water supply was perfectly safe. The incredibly corrupt utility billionaire, Arthur Sterling, was violently dragged out of his luxurious, air-conditioned office in cold, heavy silver handcuffs by furious federal health investigators. His massive, deeply greedy corporate water empire was completely, permanently dismantled by overwhelming, massive public outrage. The dangerously bypassed municipal filtration systems were immediately, entirely shut down by the state health board. They were completely, beautifully repaired and upgraded using the absolute safest, strongest, completely honest union labor and premium chemical scrubbers. The massive sprawling city was miraculously, completely saved from an absolute, terrifying public health disaster. Dalia and Roderick stood quietly by a massive, beautiful, clean public fountain in the exact center of the city park. The bright, warm summer sun beautifully sparkled off the safe, pure, crystal clear water flowing endlessly before them. Children were laughing and playing safely in the cooling mist. They had deeply, aggressively protected the absolute most essential, vital human necessity for hundreds of thousands of completely innocent people. This incredibly intense, deeply emotional chapter of our massive story teaches us an absolutely vital, unbreakable, beautiful lesson. Clean drinking water, absolute public safety, and fragile human health must absolutely never be controlled by a greedy, completely unaccountable corporate monopoly. The wealthy corporate elites will always aggressively try to quietly cut corners and poison our shared resources just to violently pad their massive offshore bank accounts. But true, undeniable, raw power is the incredibly brave, exhausted working class, fiercely smashing the heavy steel locks to safely flush out the toxic corruption. You absolutely have the massive power to aggressively stand up for the deeply vulnerable people in your own beautiful community. You just have to be incredibly brave enough to completely refuse to quietly drown in the dark. If this deeply emotional, incredibly tense story completely fueled your fierce human soul today, please aggressively hit that like button. Share this absolutely vital video with the exhausted, brave people who fiercely build and protect your local world. Subscribe to our channel to endlessly continue this massive, deeply inspiring journey of absolute human resilience. Drop an incredibly passionate comment below. Tell us exactly how you fiercely maintain strong integrity in your own beautiful life. Keep your inner fire aggressively burning. Keep fiercely protecting the innocent. And absolutely never let the cold, greedy shadows violently poison your beautiful, warm light. The brutal, freezing winds of late November aggressively howled through Holloway City. The bitter cold was rapidly turning the crowded concrete streets into dangerous sheets of solid ice. Millions of working-class families were turning up their thermostats to survive the freezing nights. They completely relied on the massive, unseen network of underground natural gas pipelines to stay warm and stay alive. Delia Marsh was not safely tucked inside a warm, comfortable office. She was deep underground in the massive, echoing concrete cavern of the city's primary natural gas distribution hub. The heavy air smelled faintly of sulfur and cold, damp earth. Delia was conducting an aggressive, unannounced safety audit of the massive pressure regulator valves. She shined her heavy flashlight on the massive steel joints connecting the primary city feed. Her heart violently dropped straight into her stomach. The massive steel valves were completely covered in thick, white frost, but underneath, the metal was heavily corroded and deeply cracked. Harrison Cole owned the massive, incredibly lucrative municipal energy contract. He was a deeply corrupt, ruthlessly greedy energy billionaire. He had quietly, illegally ordered the installation of incredibly cheap, uncertified, low-pressure cast-iron valves instead of high-grade industrial steel. He was quietly pocketing tens of millions of taxpayer dollars, meant for winter safety upgrades. The cheap valves were already violently groaning and actively leaking under the massive, freezing, winter pressure. If the winter temperatures dropped just a few more degrees, the massive public demand for heat would cause a catastrophic pressure spike. The cheap valves would violently rupture. The massive, highly pressurized natural gas would instantly flood the underground transit tunnels. A single random spark from a passing subway train would violently ignite the massive gas cloud. Entire city blocks would be instantly, violently vaporized in a massive, terrifying explosion. Thousands of innocent, sleeping families would be completely wiped out. Harrison Cole was coldly trading thousands of human lives for a massive corporate holiday bonus. Delia knew she had to permanently stop the incredibly deadly pressure buildup immediately. Delia fiercely marched straight out of the freezing tunnels. She walked aggressively into the luxurious, heavily heated, incredibly pristine executive penthouse of Cole Energy. Harrison Cole was casually sitting behind a massive, imported marble desk. He wore a perfectly tailored, incredibly expensive Italian wool suit. He was quietly sipping incredibly expensive, imported bourbon from a heavy crystal glass. Delia violently slammed her frozen diagnostic tablet and a highly sensitive digital gas leak detector directly onto his polished desk. The detector was aggressively, loudly beeping red. She fiercely demanded an immediate, total, mandatory shutdown of the compromised eastern grid. She aggressively ordered a massive, public emergency evacuation of the threatened residential blocks. Harrison Cole did not panic. He did not flinch. He did not show a single, tiny ounce of human empathy. He simply smiled a cold, incredibly chilling, deeply sociopathic smile. He quietly told her that shutting down the grid would cost his massive company millions of dollars in daily fines. He aggressively told her that the poor, working-class citizens in the affected zones were completely insignificant to his massive global empire. He completely refused to lose his massive billionaire status just because she found a few cheap, rusty pipes. He calmly reached under his expensive marble desk. He quietly pressed a hidden, silent security lock. 6 massive, heavily armed, highly elite private military contractors aggressively stepped out of the dark, warm office shadows. They were ruthless, cold-blooded, international corporate fixers wearing heavy tactical body armor. Harrison coldly ordered his terrifying mercenaries to physically drag Delia deep down into the massive, subterranean primary compressor vault. He wanted her violently locked inside the massive, highly pressurized steel blast chamber. He aggressively initiated a massive, manual pressure override on his glowing computer terminal. He wanted the highly volatile natural gas to violently flood the small, sealed chamber. He wanted her terrified screams permanently silenced by a massive, superheated gas explosion. He wanted her terrifying safety reports completely, permanently turned to pure white ash. He slowly turned his expensive leather chair back to his warm, roaring fireplace. He completely considered the annoying safety officer officially dead. The heavily armed corporate assassins grabbed Delia roughly by her heavy, insulated safety jacket. They violently dragged her out of the freezing, pristine office. They aggressively dragged her down dozens of incredibly steep, slippery, frozen, grating stairs. They dragged her incredibly deep into the terrifying, absolute bottom of the roaring gas facility. They violently shoved her into the echoing, pitch-black, freezing compressor vault. The incredibly heavy, solid steel blast door slammed securely behind her. The heavy electronic deadbolts locked into place with a terrifying, deafening, metallic crack. Delia was completely, hopelessly trapped in the freezing, terrifying, pitch-black dark. Suddenly, the massive steel pipes around her violently shuddered. A deafening, terrifying hiss aggressively filled the massive steel tank. Harrison Cole was actively, deliberately pumping the highly volatile, raw natural gas directly into the sealed chamber. The air rapidly became incredibly thick with deadly, invisible fumes. It was aggressively choking her tired lungs. The raw gas smelled intensely like deadly sulfur and pure, impending death. The massive pressure gauges on the walls were aggressively climbing into the critical red zone. A single tiny spark from her metal tools would instantly ignite the massive chamber. It would violently blow the entire facility to absolute dust. Delia knew her heavy electrical wrench was a deadly weapon in this confined room. It would be instant, undeniable suicide to strike metal against metal, but she absolutely refused to quietly suffocate or burn in the dark. She fiercely remembered the thousands of sleeping, innocent children in the fragile neighborhoods above. She completely refused to let a deeply evil billionaire incinerate her and destroy an entire city block. She desperately felt her way through the suffocating, toxic, freezing dark. She fiercely found the massive, mechanical, emergency bleed valves hidden behind the massive main compressor engine. The heavy brass manual override wheel was tightly jammed by years of deliberate, greedy corporate neglect. Delia carefully pulled a heavy, thick rubber strap from her utility belt. She completely ignored the terrifying, highly explosive gas rapidly filling her lungs. She tightly wrapped the heavy rubber strap around the frozen brass wheel to completely prevent any dangerous metallic sparks. She aggressively grabbed the heavy rubber leverage. She violently pulled with every single ounce of her massive, remaining physical strength. The heavy jammed mechanical safety valves finally, violently broke completely open, without producing a single, tiny spark. A massive deafening, terrifying roar aggressively echoed through the entire underground industrial facility. Millions of cubic feet of highly pressurized, deadly natural gas instantly roared up into the massive, towering exterior emergency ventilation stacks. The incredibly volatile gas cloud bypassed the vulnerable, ancient city pipes entirely. It safely, harmlessly vented straight up into the powerful, freezing atmospheric jet stream. It was aggressively pushed far away from the city by the massive, howling winter winds. The incredibly fragile working-class neighborhoods were instantly, completely protected from the deadly explosive pressure. But down in the dark, sealed vault, the heavy lack of oxygen finally caught up to Delia. She was rapidly, aggressively losing consciousness from the suffocating, heavy, toxic gas. The incredible physical exertion had completely drained her remaining strength. She collapsed incredibly hard onto the freezing, grated steel floor. The massive chamber was still terrifyingly cold and pitch black. Suddenly, a massive, Deafening explosion ripped the incredibly heavy steel blast door completely off its reinforced metal hinges. The heavy metal violently crashed against the concrete wall. Roderick Vance fiercely threw himself into the dark, sweltering, gas-filled, terrifying chamber. He did not bring his usual small crew of silent underworld enforcers. He brought a massive, undeniable, aggressive working-class army, dozens of incredibly massive, heavily equipped Union pipefitters, hazardous material response teams, and brave local utility workers had violently stormed the heavily guarded plant gates. They had completely overwhelmed the corrupt, highly paid international assassins by pure, unstoppable, overwhelming numbers. Roderick desperately navigated the freezing, terrifying, heavily gassed chamber. He fiercely grabbed Elia's shivering, incredibly weak, exhausted body. He violently pulled her incredibly tight against his heavy, highly protective tactical coat. He aggressively carried her completely out of the terrifying, toxic tomb. He carried her straight up the steep, metal stairs. He carried her completely out into the clean, breathable, incredibly beautiful, freezing winter air. His brave, massive army of Union workers cheered with a deafening, incredibly emotional roar as they completely secured the massive gas main lines. The city's fragile winter heating grid was perfectly, undeniably safe. The incredibly corrupt energy titan, Harrison Cole, was violently dragged out of his luxurious, pristine, bulletproof penthouse. He was aggressively placed in cold, heavy silver handcuffs by furious federal energy investigators. His incredibly massive, deeply greedy global corporate empire was completely, permanently destroyed by overwhelming, unprecedented public outrage. The dangerously cheap municipal gas pipelines were immediately, entirely shut down by the State Safety Board. They were completely, beautifully replaced and heavily upgraded using the absolute safest, strongest, completely honest union labor and premium heavy industrial steel. The massive, sprawling city was miraculously, completely saved from an absolute, terrifying winter tragedy. Delia and Roderick stood quietly on the massive, beautiful, safe, snow-covered sidewalk of a local residential neighborhood. The bright, warm streetlights beautifully pierced the cold, clear winter night. Through the frosted windows of the homes, families were safely, warmly gathered together around their heaters. The air was incredibly crisp and clean. Delia and Roderick had deeply, aggressively protected the absolute most essential, fragile human lives in the entire massive metropolis. This incredibly intense, deeply emotional chapter of our massive story teaches us an absolutely vital, unbreakable, beautiful lesson. Basic human warmth, absolute public safety, and basic human dignity must absolutely never be treated as cheap, expendable commodities by greedy, unaccountable billionaires. The wealthy, corporate elites will always aggressively try to secretly cut corners just to violently pad their massive offshore bank accounts. But true, undeniable, raw power does not live in a towering glass penthouse. Real power is the incredibly brave, exhausted working class fiercely standing together, shoulder to shoulder. Real power is having the raw courage to aggressively grip the frozen wheel and safely vent out the toxic corruption. You absolutely have the massive power to aggressively stand up for the deeply vulnerable people in your own beautiful community. You just have to be incredibly brave enough to completely refuse to freeze in the dark. If this deeply emotional, incredibly epic story completely fueled your fierce human soul today, please aggressively hit that like button. Share this absolutely vital video with the exhausted, brave people who fiercely build and protect your local world. Subscribe to our channel to endlessly continue this massive, deeply inspiring journey of absolute human resilience. Drop an incredibly passionate comment below. Tell us exactly how you fiercely stand up for justice in your own beautiful life. Keep your inner fire aggressively burning. Keep fiercely protecting the innocent. And absolutely never let the cold, greedy shadows violently extinguish your beautiful, warm light. The isolated, corrupt billionaires were absolutely not acting alone. They were all secret, highly funded members of a massive, terrifying global syndicate known only as the Vanguard. The Vanguard had completely lost billions of dollars because of one stubborn, working-class safety officer and one reformed Mafia boss. They aggressively decided they had finally, absolutely had enough of Delia Marsh and Roderick Vance. On the incredibly freezing, darkest night of the brutal winter, the Vanguard aggressively initiated a massive, highly coordinated citywide blackout. They violently hacked the central municipal power grid. They instantly plunged millions of innocent, freezing citizens into absolute, terrifying darkness. They fiercely deployed their absolute best, most lethal, heavily armed international mercenaries. They aggressively targeted Roderick's heavily fortified compound and Delia's central safety dispatch hub simultaneously. They desperately wanted to violently, permanently wipe the fierce working-class rebellion completely off the map. They wanted to violently send a terrifying, unforgettable message to the entire world. Delia was deep inside the massive central dispatch hub when the entire sprawling city grid went completely, terrifyingly black. She absolutely did not panic in the sudden dark. She aggressively grabbed her heavy emergency radio. She fiercely rallied her massive, incredibly loyal Union Army, thousands of exhausted plumbers, heavily muscular steelworkers, and brave dockworkers aggressively grabbed their heavy steel tools. They fiercely barricaded the critical municipal infrastructure. Meanwhile, Roderick Vance fought a terrifying, incredibly brutal, bloody war in the freezing, dark city streets. He aggressively led his fiercely loyal men against the massive waves of heavily armed, elite vanguard mercenaries, but Roderick was incredibly, heavily outnumbered. His men were violently pushed back block by freezing block. He aggressively fought a desperate, tactical retreat directly toward the central dispatch hub. He fiercely needed to protect Delia at absolutely all costs. The massive, heavily armed mercenary army aggressively surrounded the facility. They violently prepared to completely breach the heavy steel doors. The massive steel doors violently exploded inward with a deafening, terrifying blast. The heavily armed vanguard mercenaries aggressively flooded into the central hub. Roderick was heavily bleeding. He was fiercely shielding Delia with his own massive body in the dark control room. The violent situation looked absolutely, undeniably hopeless, but Delia fiercely remembered the massive, highly experimental backup capacitor banks she had secretly installed deep in the basement. She aggressively sprinted through the freezing dark. She completely bypassed the heavily corrupted digital safety locks. She violently grabbed the massive, heavy analog breaker switch. She aggressively slammed it closed, with every single ounce of her remaining strength. A blinding, deafening, incredibly massive surge of pure, unfiltered electricity violently blasted through the entire facility. The massive electromagnetic pulse completely, instantly fried the mercenaries' highly advanced thermal optics and heavy tactical gear. They were completely, violently blinded in the sudden, terrifying light. Roderick and his massive Union army fiercely counterattacked in the total chaos. They completely, permanently decimated the elite global syndicate. Delia aggressively threw the main relays. The massive, sprawling city grid violently roared completely back to life. It aggressively flooded the freezing, terrifying dark streets with beautiful, warm, blinding, incredibly safe light. 10 long, incredibly peaceful years finally passed. The sprawling Holloway city was completely, fundamentally transformed. It was no longer a dark, terrifying playground for greedy, corrupt billionaires. It was a massive, shining beacon of absolute safety and human dignity. Delia Marsh no longer wore a scuffed, heavy neon safety jacket. She was standing proudly in a massive, bright, beautifully sunlit university auditorium. Posey, her beautiful, brilliant daughter, was graduating at the absolute top of her advanced structural engineering class. Posey proudly held her heavy, framed degree. She ran straight past the wildly cheering crowds. She hugged her incredibly brave, exhausted mother incredibly tight. Roderick Vance stood quietly in the warm, beautiful sunlight streaming through the massive glass windows. He wore a simple, elegant dark suit. He was no longer a terrifying, cold-blooded shadow king. He was a deeply respected, incredibly peaceful guardian of the light. He smiled a rare, profound, beautifully gentle smile. The terrifying, freezing wars were completely, permanently over. Two fiercely broken people had beautifully, permanently healed an entire city. This brings us to the absolute, incredibly emotional end of our massive epic journey. Delia's fierce, beautifully brave life teaches us the most profound human lesson in the entire world. The greatest, most undeniable power on earth is not massive offshore wealth. It is not terrifying physical violence. It is the fierce, unbreakable, everyday courage of an ordinary person, standing up for the highly vulnerable and innocent. You absolutely have that exact same massive, undeniable power sleeping deep inside your own chest. You just have to be incredibly brave enough to completely wake it up. If this massive, 2-hour epic journey completely moved your soul today, please aggressively smash that like button. Share this vital masterpiece with the brave, exhausted people who fiercely work hard to protect your family every single day. Subscribe to our channel to endlessly continue this massive, deeply inspiring journey of human resilience. Drop an incredibly passionate comment below. Tell us exactly how you plan to fiercely protect the beautiful light in your own life. Keep your inner fire aggressively burning. Keep fiercely protecting the innocent and absolutely never let the cold, greedy dark violently extinguish your beautiful, warm light. Goodbye, and stay incredibly fierce.